From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons.
Another Biden gaffe adds insult to injury after a scathing DOJ report highlighting his poor memory and mishandling of classified documents. We'll speak to former special counsel to the White House, Cobb, about the investigation and its ramifications.
Meanwhile, Biden meets with German Chancellor Olaf Scholz at the White House with Ukraine on the agenda. Former NSC official Alexander Vindman will join us this hour with more on the state of affairs as the Senate gets set to spend Super Bowl weekend trying to pass a supplemental aid package.
A new deadline. Is the Senate now in play? Republican Larry Hogan announces a run for Senate in Maryland, while Congressman Matt Rosendale announces a run for Montana Senate. We'll have more with our political panel coming up. Interesting wrinkle in the political waters here today with that one, Kaylee. But of course, we're trying to gauge the fallout from what was a very emotional news conference, an angry one, I guess we could say, with Joe Biden last night following that special counsel report.
Yes, he came out, talked to reporters, definitely had some choice words about the special counsel and his choice of words specifically. As we know in the report, Robert Hur called Biden a well-meaning elderly man with a poor memory. This was Biden's counter to that exact line.
I'm well-meaning, and I'm an elderly man, and I know what the hell I'm doing. I've been president. I put this country back on its feet. My memory is fine. My memory, take a look at what I've done since I become president. None of you thought I could pass any of the things I got passed. How'd that happen? You know, I guess I just forgot what was going on. I'm the most qualified person in this country to be president of the United States and finish the job I started.
Joining us now at the table, Bloomberg's Michael Shepard and Megan Scully. Michael, I'd like to start with you with your view of the White House here from last night. This was arguably a tough day for the Biden administration. He thought he could come out, right the ship with this news conference. It's being debated now this day after whether that was a good idea. How long will it take before we know?
Well, I think we're going to know in November, really, Joe, to be honest, because this put the issue front and center for the public, for voters, in a way that we hadn't really seen before. During the 2020 campaign, age was obviously an issue, and it had been bubbling in the background through the first 3 years that he's been in office. But now that we're getting real, we're getting into the re-election campaign, it's all of a sudden in front of us in a way we hadn't quite seen before.
Absolutely. And of course, with the memory question and the age question top of mind yesterday, perhaps all the more bruising for Biden to make the gaffe that he did when he was answering a question about the Middle East. Instead of referring to President al-Sisi, the president of Egypt, as the president of that nation, he said that he was the president of Mexico. Let's remind ourselves.
As you know, initially, the president of Mexico, Sisi, did not want to open up the gate to allow humanitarian material to get in. I talked to him. I convinced him to open the gate.
Now, it's worth noting for fairness, we have also seen some confusion on the part of former President Donald Trump, who very likely will be his opponent in the general election, on multiple cases referring to Nikki Haley as someone who would have had control over security at the Capitol on January 6th, when indeed that was Nancy Pelosi. So it's not just Biden that we have seen this from, yet it really is Biden where it seems to be the issue in polling. People are concerned far more about his age than necessarily Donald Trump's.
Somehow, Kaylee, it does stick to the president more than it does to a lot of other people. We even saw Mike Johnson, the House Speaker, transpose Israel and Iran during an interview over the weekend. So these things do happen. It just happened for Biden this week, very unfortunately, because he had also transposed the names of foreign leaders in two previous appearances during fundraisers in New York City. And that just added to I guess, the focus and the buildup around this issue on age. And the way he responded at the end of the day, the hastily arranged news conference, they didn't sleep on it. He came out firing, and it didn't work out the way I think that they had planned.
There are comparisons to James Comey today in Washington. We're reading the line that that Hur pulled a Comey that was just a couple of months before the election. This is much further away. I wonder, though, if we'll still look back at this as a turning point in the campaign.
Well, we may, and as I said, we will know in several months the lasting effect. Already, though, we're seeing how Democrats are starting to message and strategize around the age question. They've been forced to confront it much more quickly than maybe they were prepared to do. One, we saw Vice President Kamala Harris going after the special counsel very specifically, calling the report's wording on memory gratuitous and politically motivated. Two, we've also seen Democrats turn the focus back on Donald Trump. Kayleigh, as you mentioned, the former president, Biden's predecessor and likely opponent in November, has had his own share of verbal gaffes over the years. And then three, we're also seeing how Democrats, some of them at least, are saying, look, we need to get the president out there more. If he gets more repetitions in front of the public, maybe this will give him a chance to smooth out some of those miscues and missteps. And people who've known Biden over the years, people who covered him on Capitol Hill, as senator, they would have seen some of this in the hallways of the Capitol and maybe not thought so much of it. Right. It's just now it acquires a new focus and new attention.
Well, and of course, at the same time, he still has to be president and carry out presidential duties, which included today hosting German Chancellor Olaf Scholz at the White House, where they talked about one particular issue, that is Ukraine. Take a listen.
Failure of the United States Congress, if it occurs, not to support Ukraine is close to criminal neglect. It is outrageous.
Megyn describes it as close to criminal, and yes, yet we have seen that it is very difficult for Congress to get its act together on a supplemental package that would include Ukraine aid. The Senate did advance it in a test vote. We're waiting for the actual vote. They're going to stick around until the Super Bowl to find out, maybe beyond. That's the new deadline?
Yes, it could go into next week. Tuesday, I think, would be the sort of the deadline to pass this in terms of all the procedural hurdles it has to clear. We're hoping it happens before then. But it appears poised to pass the Senate pretty easily. It passed on that test vote. That was the biggest hurdle that it essentially had. Now they're just negotiating on which amendments they're going to vote. Most of those amendments will be voted down. We're not expecting a whole lot to change. The Senate is just doing its senating thing. The big sticking point we see, of course, is the House. And Speaker Johnson has said this package will not go on the floor. It lacks the H.R. 2, the diehard Republican immigration package, the one that hardliners in the House refuse to even consider Ukraine until that passes the House and the Senate. It's already passed the House. So it's going to be interesting to see then what happens. We might end up seeing a pairing of some Democrats with Republicans, with a handful of moderates, to try to get this across the finish line using a little-known procedure called a discharge petition that's been used twice this century, and this would be the third time. But stranger things have certainly happened in the last week on Capitol Hill. So we could see that as a way to get this across.
Well, Hakeem Jeffries has indicated that he's open to any legislative tool, I think was the line, that takes to get this done. So is Hakeem Jeffries going to be the one who drives this through the House?
He certainly could. What he would need, though, is the backing of a handful of Republicans, and he'd need to keep his own caucus together. Right. There's Israel funding in here, which has been divisive among Democrats.
Well, to that end, he may need a larger share of Republicans than usual.
Yes,
this is an interesting dynamic.
You could end up with like a very strange coalition to get this over. Now, this Senate package does have money for Gaza, though, so that could sweeten the deal for some of those progressives who wouldn't pass an Israel-only package.
All right, Bloomberg's Megyn Scully. I'm sure you're going to have a fun weekend ahead of you as the Senate continues to do its work. And our thanks as well to Bloomberg's Mike Shepard. Now, coming up next, we turn to the war in Ukraine from an actual geopolitical sense. What is happening on the ground, what Ukraine might need in this moment. We'll be joined by retired Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
The question is how much time do we all have? Because what Ukraine is on the front lines. But Russia, together with Iran, together with North Korea, is challenging not only us. So we will fight as long as we have to fight to win this war. And we have to also show that while all these dictators stay together in their club and helping each other, we have to also show that we can stay the course.
Ukrainian ambassador to the U.S., Oksana Markarova, speaking with us yesterday here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. And this is as an aid bill for Ukraine and Israel is slowly moving its way through the Senate. They'll continue to do work on that this weekend, but the House remains a very big question. Joining us now is retired Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, director at the Institute for Informed American Leadership and former director for European Affairs at United States National Security Council. Lieutenant Colonel, thank you very much for joining us this evening. Even if this aid package were to get through the Senate, there is a very real chance that it could not pass in the House of Representatives. Can Ukraine win this war without additional U.S. aid?
Winning the war is a high bar, even with aid from the U.S. I think the fact is that most of 2024 is going to be a build year. Being able to mobilize additional troops, retrain troops, stockpile ammunition. Really, you're not going to see major movements on the Ukrainian side until well deep into 2024. But more than likely, they're probably planning ahead to 2025. Is the likely point where we could see some additional movement. I think that's the case for Russia too. Russia is not going to make major headway. It's now fighting for small slivers of land. It's likely to make advances because right now the Russians outmatch the Ukrainians. The Russians are getting support from the Iranians with regards to drones, the North Koreans with regards to artillery, and frankly, the support from the U.S. has fallen off. Now the West is plugging some holes. Europe is plugging some holes, providing some additional resources. It's stepping up in a big way, but nothing could fill the gap of the absence of the U.S. The U.S. is the arsenal of democracy. So in terms of winning, that is just a very, very high bar. What we could expect the Ukrainians to do is to hold what they have with some rollbacks from the Russians, and then build for an offensive later down the road. That's the most likely scenario.
There's new leadership in the armed forces in Ukraine, thanks to President Zelensky. Lieutenant Colonel, I wonder if you think that improves or hurts conditions on the battlefields. Reporting suggests that Ukrainian soldiers are not the biggest fans.
Yeah, it's probably not going to have a disastrous effect, but it's not going to necessarily have a positive effect. The biggest impact of the change is that the president of Ukraine is entitled to pick his military leaders. Zelensky didn't quite deliver the way that Zelensky didn't quite deliver the way Zelensky needed him to, and frankly, Zelensky was becoming quite popular, and that was a difficult position for the president to be in. So he switched out to a more favorable, more frankly, a more trustworthy military brass. Now, in terms of the effects on the ground, fundamentally, things don't really change that much. Ukraine is still suffering a reduction in artillery. Ukraine is getting slowly outmatched in regards to drones. Syrskyi doesn't have the best reputation amongst the frontline troops and the brigade commanders. He has some, unfortunately, his reputation in a lot of ways is built on the bloodshed that Ukraine suffered around Bakhmut, suffering somewhere in the ballpark of 20,000 casualties. So I think that doesn't endear him to the troops. But actually, as a matter of fact, I think it's bigger than that. It's the fact that Zelensky, the outgoing commander, actually was quite popular. So these are issues that are going to be worked through, but it's not going to have a major impact on the war anytime in the near future. I think, like I said, this 2024 is going to be mainly a build year to conduct a counteroffensive down the road.
Well, I wonder what 2024, though, will be for Russia in the eyes of Vladimir Putin. He, of course, as I'm sure you're well aware, Lieutenant Colonel, did an interview with Tucker Carlson on the Tucker Carlson network and talked about conditions for negotiations potentially to bring this thing to an end. Take a listen.
What we are conveying to the U.S. leadership. If you really want to stop fighting, you need to stop supplying weapons. It will be over within a few weeks. That's it. And then we can agree on some terms.
And as we do have questions about to what extent the U.S. will be providing additional weapons or anything else, is the U.S. effectively sending a signal to Putin if this does not pass that maybe it is time to think about end stages here?
Well, I think the fact is it's out of the U.S. hands. The Ukrainians started this war basically on their own. They didn't get any support whatsoever. Frankly, modest support in the first 4 months. They had some anti-tank systems, limited man-pad surface-to-air missile systems. They did that on their own. They're back kind of at square one with regards to U.S. support. That's almost all falling off now because of we've expended the funds that were allocated by Congress. Europe is stepping up. Europe is actually providing some additional resources, not in the quantity that's required. But there is no end in this war anytime in the near future. The Ukrainians are not willing to sacrifice the people that are subjected to Russian oppression in occupied territory. The commentary from Vladimir Putin is actually pretty absurd if you think about it. U.S. is not providing aid to Ukraine at the moment, and the war is not ending. The Ukrainians are making do. The Ukrainians are actually holding ground, conducting minor counterattacks and things of that nature. So there's no real easy way to end this war. And as for Tucker Carlson, it should be a pretty embarrassing moment for him. Certainly, he's catering to our enemies, catering to the enemies of the United States, and feeding the beast with regards to the extreme elements of the Republican Party, and that is something, a shame that he's going to have to live with going forward.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll tell you, the Trump factor is in the air here. We're talking about arriving at an agreement here on a funding deal to get through the rest of this year. But if Donald Trump became the next president of the United States, there are real questions about the direction this would take. Of course, he says he could stop this war in 24 hours. It's something that I asked Ukrainian ambassador to the U.S., Oksana Markarova, about yesterday in our interview, and I was struck by her answer, Lieutenant Colonel. Let's listen to what she said and have you respond.
We have to thank Donald Trump for providing us first javelins. It was Donald Trump's administration, and I was the Minister of Finance then, worked a lot with the administration. The decision on the lethal aid to Ukraine was taken by Donald Trump and his people.
Alexander Vindman, as somebody who was on the so-called perfect call with Donald Trump and President Zelensky, what's your reaction?
I mean, yes, in fact, our javelins were released to Ukraine in the Trump administration. This was a national security endeavor that was some time coming. There was a push from the national security apparatus under the Obama administration to release those weapons. Under the leadership of H.R. McMaster, the national security advisor for Trump, that decision was made. I would say that President Trump played basically no role in that. I understand what Ambassador Makarova is saying here. She's trying to thread the needle, figure out if there's a way to claw back some sort of relationship with Trump world, with MAGA wing of the Republican Party.
Would he be a trusted ally to Ukraine?
No, it's a fool's errand. It's a fool's errand to try to think that there's some way to ingratiate back with Trump. Trump is notoriously vindictive. He fired me because I reported his corruption. It was behind closed doors in official channels. It ended up becoming public and resulting in his impeachment. But I was fired days after he was acquitted by the Senate. There is no way to claw back a relationship for Ukraine. And frankly, more importantly for Donald Trump is the fact that he cheerleads for Vladimir Putin. He's a fan of Vladimir Putin, the way Vladimir Putin wields power. So I think the Ukrainians are still not quite sure how to manage the fact that half of the political establishment in the United States is anti-Ukraine. Certainly the extreme elements of are, but they're doing the best they can. They're trying to preserve relationships, and that's what diplomats do.
Well, we appreciate your reflecting on that. Our thanks to retired Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman today on Balance of Power. Coming up, the Labor Department releasing revised inflation data for 2023, and we've got the takeaways next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Over the past 3 years, the Biden administration has driven an historic recovery. GDP growth is strong and inflation has declined significantly. The median worker in the United States, if you compare today with 2019, can buy the same basket of goods with $1,400 left over to save or spend. So Americans, on average, are better off in spite of the fact that the level of prices is higher.
U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, of course, addressing the fight against inflation during 2 days of testimony on Capitol Hill. This as the Labor Department releases revised inflation data for 2023. Joining us now to discuss, Bloomberg Economics chief U.S. economist Anna Wong. It does seem like the inflation news keeps getting better for this administration as we add another log on the fire today.
Yeah, it definitely. I think today's revisions is unambiguously good news for them because it shows that the disinflation we have been seeing in the last 6 months is not a mirage, that it is indeed happening. And even better for the Fed is that when you map these CPI revised figures into the metric that they care about, which is the core PCE deflator, the disinflation progress looks even better in the fourth quarter of last year.
Well, and I wonder how the consumer must be feeling if you are starting to see the inflationary pressures abating. Also, it's worth keeping in mind here that the S&P 500 closed above 5,000 today. We're at a new record high in stocks. For those that are invested, I'm sure that adds to your feeling of wealth. Should we start to see what we're seeing in the markets showing up more in sentiment?
Yeah, I think so. Next Friday, we're going to get the University of Michigan consumer sentiment. We expect it to be a pretty strong one because so far sentiment has been driven by inflation news. But I have to say that consumers are actually looking at things at price levels. And many prices are still elevated to where they used to be before the pandemic. And when people look at prices, they feel terrible because they're thinking, well, a burger is now permanently like $20 relative to when it was like $10. McDonald's in California is going to be much more expensive in a couple months' time when the minimum wage is too high. So I think still there's a lot of angst going on within households. And we could see that in the fact that demand for government assistance programs for poverty programs is still very high. So I think still a lot of people are under strains of inflation. Right?
Well, especially in the lower income brackets. Right. Thank you so much, Anna Wong of Bloomberg Economics. And Joe, perhaps that explains why you won't see President Biden necessarily flexing the levels of the stock market.
S&P 5,000, unlike the last guy, I guess.
Right. He used to make hats. I don't know if we're getting hats this time. But coming up, speaking of former President Trump, we'll have more perspective on his legal battles and reaction to yesterday's Supreme Court arguments, as well as the report from the special counsel Robert Hur. Ty Cobb will be with us next. This is Bloomberg.
We're in a very pressurized political environment. And when you are the first special counsel in history not to indict anybody, there is pressure to criticize.
Ian Sams, spokesman for the White House Counsel's office, in response to yesterday's report from the special counsel investigating Joe Biden's handling of classified documents. A scathing report, as we've established. Let's bring in an expert on this, former special White House counsel Ty Cobb. It's great to see you, Ty. Thanks for being with us here. You know Mr. Hur. You've worked with him. Some folks think he crossed the line here. A well-meaning elderly man with a poor memory. Was that necessary?
I'm not sure the poor memory comment was necessary. I think I might have, and maybe Rob, on second thought, might have stopped by or otherwise characterized him by saying he would make a very sympathetic defendant, and emphasize the timeline here. I think the timeline, adds to the validity of those as genuine considerations as to why not to prosecute. The degree to which degree of detail provided, I think, was unusual, and I think it subject to criticism. I'll be interested to hear what Rob says.
Yeah, and given you are an attorney, I'd like to ask you about that decision not to prosecute, knowing that in Donald Trump's classified documents case, he was charged with many felonies. 31 of the 37 felonies were willful retention of national defense information. 31 of those charges, after Robert Hur found that Biden also willfully retained classified documents. I went back to the Trump indictment just to get a sense of why these cases maybe would be different. The specific language does say that Trump did willfully retain documents and failed to deliver them to the officer, an employee of the United States entitled to receive them. That is, that Trump, without authorization, retained at the Mar-a-Lago Club documents relating to the national defense. So is it about the duration of retention here? Why would Trump get charged with 31 felonies if Biden did not?
Well, on the duration, Biden is way ahead of Trump. I mean, keep in mind that Biden knew, well, the proof shows that he knew for at least 7 years that he had a large cache of classified documents. So I don't think it was that. I think what actually, and I don't think Trump would have been charged if, he had actually given the documents back when they were requested. Nobody requested them of Biden because they didn't know he had. But I think, as the report reflects, this goes back to Biden's time in the Senate, which is, almost 2 decades ago. And I think that, I think under the totality of the evidence that's presented in this 347-page report, it's clear crimes were committed. What Rob concluded was, he might not be able to convict Biden because Biden would be a sympathetic witness. And I don't think he explained the timeline enough for people to really understand the importance of those considerations, because under current Justice Department policy, a president cannot be indicted while in office. So that means 2 years from now. And once indicted, it would take a year to a year and a half to get to trial. So, you're almost 4 years out from now when you would take this case to trial, and he's only going to become more sympathetic during that period. Now, how do you square that with the fact that he's likely to be president during that period? I think that's what concerns the White House these days.
I'll ask you about the role the Attorney General played here, or did not play, as the case may be. Merrick Garland just basically let this pass through without edits, very different than the way Bill Barr handled Robert Mueller's report, certainly. I asked Michael Zeldin about that today, former federal prosecutor who served as an independent counsel in the George H.W. Bush administration, about the AG's role here. Here's what he said.
To overcome that problem has said, look, what you give me is what's going to go out. I don't want to have any appearance like Barr did of putting my finger on the scale. And so that's what happened here. And I think that if we're a normal case, this report may not have seen the light of day in its current form.
Well, if you agree with that take, Ty, but should Merrick Garland have done some editing?
No. And press reports aside, Barr didn't edit Mueller's report either. What Barr was criticized for was the summary that he provided to Congress, which he was statutorily obligated to do. And he and Mueller had a difference of opinion as to whether it had been accurately summarized. But no, the Attorney General should not edit a special counsel's report, because that injects politics in a statutory situation where it's prohibited.
Well, Donald Trump certainly thinks politics are at play. He said so repeatedly, including in the aftermath of this report. He says it's proven evidence of a two-tiered justice system. I want to return, though, to something you said just a moment ago, the idea that President Biden couldn't be indicted right now because he is a sitting president. Donald Trump also has called into question whether he can be indicted even when he's not sitting in the Oval Office. He could, as soon as Monday, appeal that question to the Supreme Court after, here in Washington, the appellate court said that he could indeed be prosecuted. Do you expect the Supreme Court would take that case, knowing they also now have to decide on Colorado's 14th Amendment decision as well?
So I don't think the Colorado ballot case will play at all in their consideration with regard to whether the immunity case.
It seems like we're having a little bit of an issue with Ty Cobb's connection, but of course... Sorry, Ty, if you can hear us, please go ahead.
Yeah, no, so I was going to say the Supreme Court has several options in terms of how they could proceed. They could grant a stay, pull the judges, and deny cert. They could transform the stay request into a petition for cert and deny cert, or take certiorari and move quickly. And I think personally, and I believe I'm in the minority of constitutionalists on this, that there's a strong likelihood that they will not take the case. The Court of Appeals opinion is dispositive. There's really nothing to add to the jurisprudence here. The Supreme Court may feel it has to have the last word, but if they don't, the decision of the D.C. Circuit is, an epic, well-reasoned, consequential opinion that will, stand the test of many decades of reconsideration.
We actually heard from former President Trump. He spoke following the arguments in front of the Supreme Court on Colorado's case, specifically against his name on the ballot. Here's what he said.
Our Supreme Court hopefully will be doing something in terms of helping our country and preserving democracy. We have to preserve our democracy. And I think they had a very, very interesting day and a very beautiful day. Perhaps I think it was really a very beautiful sight to watch.
A beautiful day on the court, Ty Cobb. It sounds to me, if I'm understanding you right, though, that he should be preparing for a court date with Jack Smith at some point here before the election.
I believe so. I think, it's interesting to hear Trump talk about protecting democracy, because there's been no president in our history who has been a greater threat to democracy and done more to destabilize it. Trump doesn't really care about democracy. He does care about what happens to him, and I think he's concerned about the Jack Smith case going to trial. It will go to trial, I believe. I think the Supreme Court will move quickly. The D.C. Circuit, while it was criticized for taking 28 days to issue an opinion that would have ordinarily taken them a year, that they moved a lot of obstacles out of the way in the way they came down with the opinion by accelerating the mandate and basically eliminating any possibility or any reason that Trump would have to seek en banc review of the full court.
All right, Ty Cobb, former Special White House Counsel, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Appreciate your time. Now, coming up, our political panel will be with us as we look at the political ramifications of President Biden's gaffe last night and the comments on his memory in Special Counsel Hur's report. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I agree with President Biden's reaction, which was absolutely outrageous, to question the president's experience in the death of his son. That was just totally out of bounds. I don't have any other point on this.
Maryland Democratic Senator Chris Van Hollen earlier today defending President Biden's reaction to the report by Special Counsel Robert Hur released last night that called attention to what he said was, quote, the president's poor memory, also saying that he struggled to remember what years he was vice president and the year of the death of his son, Beau Biden. So here to discuss is our political panel, Rick Davis, partner at Stone Court Capital, and Stephanie Murphy, former Democratic congresswoman from Florida. So, Rick, obviously we can delve into this entire issue Biden seems to have with the perception of his mental acuity and his age, his ability to hold office for a second term. The fact that he came out last night, knowing that it did end in a gaffe as well, mistaking the president of Egypt for the president of Mexico, did he do himself any favors at all in trying to come to his own defense?
No, look, I understand completely that people, just like Joe Biden, they're members of Congress, senators, governors, and the president of the United States, they take these things personally. And guys like me are constantly telling them, it's not personal. Don't take anything personally. And so the fact that he took it personally, he came out, he was hot, he was mad, he used a lot of curse words. This is not presidential, and this is not good for a candidate running for president. If he wanted to address it, he needed to do it in more clinical fashion, maybe let it calm down a little bit, let his staff deal with it for a while. But like what he did last night, I think just added fuel to the fire.
Well, we heard from Frank Luntz on the president's age issue at the beginning of this year in a conversation on Bloomberg. Let's listen.
Joe Biden is simply too old for too many Americans. Now, I don't believe that the young voters in the end will end up with Donald Trump, but I do consider them very likely to stay at home. And Hispanics and black voters have moved over in the direction of Donald Trump in a way that is significant. It's measurable, it's meaningful.
I want to go to Stephanie Murphy here. Congresswoman, it's great to have you back. As a Democrat, how much do you worry about this? The president has some time, I guess, to manage this issue, but it does seem to be the biggest problem facing him in this re-election cycle.
I think one of the things that's true about campaigns is that the attacks on you that are most potent are the ones that are believable. And the American people already believe that, or are concerned about his age and his ability to conduct his job. And now they have a report written by a high-level federal official that supports that perspective. And then the president went out and did that press conference. And I think that press conference was evidence of why the campaign has been keeping the president out of sight. He almost landed that press conference, and then he came back to the podium and made a serious gaffe. And what Frank was talking about is the fracturing of his base. So all of that combined is incredibly troublesome.
So, Congresswoman, do you think there is a world in which Joe Biden may not ultimately end up the Democratic nominee, that he is not, in fact, on the ballot in November? Because some are discussing that in the aftermath of this.
I'm sure there are a lot of people who are like, well, maybe this is a moment to exit stage right and, get a clean slate, because all the polling says that if any other Democrat other than Biden or Harris runs against Trump, it will be a clean victory. And I think this country needs a decisive election this fall. My big concern is that whoever prevails in the election, it will be too narrow if the presumptive Democratic and the presumptive Republican candidates have this rematch, a Trump-Biden rematch, that it will be so narrow that we might see some of the political violence and sort of challenges to our democracy that we saw 4 years ago.
One of the criticisms of Joe Biden, Rick, is that he hasn't allowed a younger generation to rise up here. We're getting pretty late in the game to be starting presidential campaigns. If Joe Biden decided, last night didn't go real well, I'm going to bow out for somebody like Gavin Newsom or Gretchen Whitmer, how would that happen? How would they assemble a staff and create an organization in time?
Well, there's a lot of infrastructure in politics, and you can't assume that just because someone has a presidential campaign, that can't be converted into somebody else's presidential campaign. And as long as you do it before the convention, that's when you launch the general election campaign. And I think, as Stephanie Murphy just said, when you look at all those people you just mentioned, and many more, there actually is a very healthy bench of future presidential candidates in the Democratic Party. That's not their problem. Their problem is they got one guy standing in the way of their success, and that's Joe Biden. So if you could tee up any of those folks at the convention, there's no question that you can create a lot of excitement by doing something like that, and it gets very limited as to how Republicans can respond to that. How much can you pick on someone in 60 days rather than having an entire year ahead of you? So there's actually some merit to surprising the world by putting someone else on the floor for a nomination.
Well, of course, we also could see a surprise in the form of a third-party entrant, someone like No Labels entering the picture. For a while, Rick, we thought that No Labels ticket may include Larry Hogan, former governor of Maryland. Instead, Larry Hogan says today, I'm running for Senate. I'm going to try to flip a very blue seat red. If anyone can do it, can he?
Well, he's certainly got the best shot of any Republican in Maryland of sending a Republican senator to Washington. And they do have a notorious habit of electing Republicans for governor, but not really sending them to Washington, even though it's just right across the bridge. So the reality here is he's got a hard slog. But if anybody could make that seat competitive, and I think on Mitch McConnell's list now of targeted states, it's got to include Maryland.
Stephanie, what did you think when you saw this? I'm just curious quickly, could we be in a world where both chambers flip? The House goes Democratic, the Senate goes Republican. Is that what we're in for?
I think I'd put my money on the Senate going Republican before I'd put any money on the House. I think the House really is still very much a toss-up. We're going to get a preview of what that might look like here next week with that special election to replace George Santos in New York. New York has been a bellwether in many ways. We lost 4 seats there the year that we lost the Democratic majority. And so I think we should stay tuned and pay close attention to that special.
All right, coming up, Super Bowl weekend upon us. Who's going to be working during the game? Senators, apparently, and their staff. We'll find out about that. Rick and Stephanie are back with us coming up on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This Sunday, more than 100 million people are expected to be watching the 49ers take on the Chiefs at the Super Bowl. Senators are expected to be in Washington working on the Ukraine, Israel, Taiwan package. That, according to Chuck Schumer. Let's see if that really happens. Rick Davis and Stephanie Murphy are back with us as we reassemble our panel. Rick, you served some time in the Senate yourself. There's a lot of talk about jet fumes and deadlines. This is real, right? People are going to want to finish the work before the game. There'll be a cloture vote Sunday night.
Oh, yeah. You're going to see all kinds of cars lined up at National Airport as quick as they can to get home. And look, I mean, there is good evidence that they're going to get a time agreement on how many amendments they're going to take. They want to take some because that's a good way to get members to sign on to the bill. So they want as big a majority as they can to usher this bill over to the House and make it harder and harder for them not to pass it. So I think Schumer is going to move his magic. That'll be up late tonight, and we'll see what he comes out with tomorrow.
Well, Congressman, I find this question of how big of a majority it gets in the Senate an interesting one. The idea that you need a decisive Republican vote in support for it to even stand a chance in the House. When the House is still pushing H.R. 2, a bill that passed with 0 Democrats voting for it, and they still think it's worthy of a vote on the floor in the Senate. So how do you justify not putting this on the floor if you're Mike Johnson?
You know, I think that was a rule of thumb from Congress's past. This Congress is definitely very much different. Not only are the margins super slim, but in an election year, usually there's very little oxygen in D.C. for legislating, except for this year, the Republicans are saying the quiet part out loud. They do not want to give President Biden a win, and they're being directed by Trump to prevent that. And because members of Congress, all of them are going to be on the ballot this fall, members of the House of Representatives, all are going to be on the ballot this fall, they're a bit more susceptible to what the former president wants because they have a base that they have to appease. And so I think even if they get it through the Senate, it's going to be much harder to get it on the floor, whether the Speaker Johnson puts it on the floor, or they try to do it by suspension, or actually move it through regular process and get it through the rules. It's going to be hard.
What if Hakeem Jeffries pulled off this discharge petition we're hearing about and got a coalition of Democrats and Republicans to work right around the Speaker?
I will tell you, as somebody, when we were in the majority, often threatened to sign a discharge petition, how hard it is actually to go down to the floor and sign said discharge petition. Also, there are procedural rules that require a certain amount of time. You can only sign on certain days, on certain weeks that begin on that we're in session on Monday. So there are some arcane rules that actually make it a little more difficult. But to sign a discharge petition as a Republican is to go to the House floor and say you are handing power over to the minority. And that's a really tough thing to do in an election year.
A little reality check there.
Yeah. All right. Finally, just because we did open this with the Super Bowl, Rick Davis, Chiefs or 49ers?
My daughter requires me to be a Chiefs fan.
Okay. Because of Taylor Swift?
Of course.
Okay. Congresswoman, Chiefs or 49ers? Are you a Swiftie?
I have the same answer. My daughter is also a big
everyone does.
Swift fan. So we're really there to watch the cutaways to her.
People need to understand, Kaylee Lines is a real football fan.
Yes.
I mean, I know you're a Taylor Swift fan, too.
Yes.
But this is like phone comes off the hook on the night of the Super Bowl.
Yes.
Well, how are you going to be? Is this with Dad? How do you spend
in my own apartment, just with my husband, focused. I don't need...
Who do you have?
I think I don't want it to be the 49ers because I wanted the Lions to win, but I don't know.
Stephanie Murphy, Rick Davis, we thank you. There's still time to get to Vegas, you know.
If only. If only. Meanwhile, here in Washington, check out the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online.
Thanks for joining us on Balance of Power. Have fun at the Super Bowl. We'll see you Monday. This is Bloomberg.